The domain name system, what it is to resolve. In the telephone world, we must know phone numbers. In the internet world, we use domain names, which are much easier for humans to remember. The concept and issues with the domain names themselves is reviewed elsewhere. The why domain. Here we will review what our computers do to resolve domain names, how this process is used maliciously, and what are some alternatives. We'll first review some foundational concepts: domain names and IP addresses, iterative lookup, recursive lookup. This is intended to be technically accurate, but not technically detailed. Traditionally, the example is Alice wants to send a message to Bob, or Alice's computer wants to send a message to Bob's computer. Domain names and IP addresses. Computers do not communicate directly with names, but numbers. For a simple example, assume Alice's computer is number 1, Bob's is number 2, and Sam's is number 3. Computer number 1 is sending a message to number 2. Either the delivery mechanism must ensure that the message only goes to number 2 and not number 3, or if number 3 receives the message, it should be ignored, since it was not addressed to it. While our Alice and Bob are fictional, human beings do not address each other as number 1 and number 2, but as Alice and Bob. So when Alice uses a computer to speak with Bob, some underlying technique is used to translate Alice to number 1 and Bob to number 2 to allow the computers, and therefore the people, to communicate. For our computer world, Alice and Bob use a human-friendly domain name, and the DNS translates domain names into the computer-friendly numeric identifier, or IP address. Internet Protocol, or IP addresses, are 32-bit numbers, or a bit over 4 billion possibilities. They are typically written in a form that makes it clear that this is an IP address. For example, 127.0.0.1, or 10.23.45.67. These are version 4 addresses, or IPv4. Version 6, or IPv6, uses a 128-bit number to massively expand the possible addresses, but essentially the same for our review. Until the late 1970s, there was a simple file that listed the names and the related addresses to each computer. With typical data rates still only about 2400 bits per second and a growing file size, a new method to manage the name-to-IP relationship had to be found. In the early 1980s, the domain name system was born. A tree structure was defined where there is a single root, a limited number of top-level domains, or TLD. Each top-level domain would have second-level domains, or SLD, that could in turn have third and fourth levels or more. The primary users were assigned a TLD, such as MIL for the U.S. military. Considering most of the funding came from the military via the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, they had and continue to have their own TLD. It is worth noting that DARPA was formerly known as ARPA, and therefore you will frequently see names or mentions of ARPA or ARPANET. A reverse DNS lookup will give you something ending in in-addr.ARPA, Internet Address ARPA, which shows its ARPA legacy. Other early TLDs included COM, EDU, Gov, Net, and Org. Two-letter TLDs were reserved as country codes. Examples are US, UK, CA, AU, and NZ, which collectively are known as the Five Eyes. When Alice's computer wants to communicate with Bob's computer, Alice's computer must resolve Bob's domain name. There are multiple ways this can occur. In all cases, this is done by a program on essentially every computer that communicates via domain names. Let's consider how this domain resolution can occur with the assumption that Alice's computer has a domain name of alice.example.com with an IP of 10.1.1.1. Bob's computer is at bob.example.org with an IP of 10.2.2.2. Iterative lookup. Alice's computer does it all. An iterative lookup is where Alice's computer does all the work. For now, we assume that Alice's computer has been pre-programmed with the addresses of one or more root name servers. These are the only addresses that Alice's computer needs to know to start. Alice's computer sends a DNS query to a root name server asking for either bob.example.org or simply org. The root name server will return with one or more IP addresses of the org name servers. With this information in hand, Alice's computer now sends another query to one of the org name servers asking for either bob.example.org or simply example.org. The org name server will return one or more IP addresses for the example.org name server. Now Alice's computer has more specific information to use and sends a third DNS query to an example.org name server requesting bob.example.org. The example.org name server will return with the specific or authoritative response that bob.example.org is at 10.2.2.2. Note that Bob's computer is not involved in this process and will not know that it is occurring. Recursive lookup. A server does it all. The iterative technique works well, but if Alice's computer is connected via a slow link to the internet, the response time might be slow to make all three queries. A second technique is built into the DNS message structure, that being a recursive lookup. Alice's computer has an IP address of a DNS server. This is typically a configuration option or automatically provided by Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol or DHCP message. How this occurs is beyond our scope. Alice's computer sends a DNS query message to the DNS server asking for bob.example.org. The DNS server will then do the same process as if Alice's computer did all the work, and when complete, send only one response with the final answer to Alice's computer. The DNS server may have faster connections to the other DNS servers, so the process will be faster. The DNS server may also be providing the service to many users and can hold on to the information or cache the data so that it does not have to repeatedly request the same information from all the servers. A clear example would be that once the TLD's name servers are known, they don't have to be checked again for a long period, but the local data or cache can be used repeatedly. Hijacking a query. We now have a glimpse of what the domain name system is, how it was developed, and how it is used. Now let us look at how it is used against you. There are many techniques that are used to fool or force the DNS to return an incorrect IP address. DNS cache poisoning is where the DNS server you are querying, or one of its queries, has its cache modified by an unauthorized party. While it remains an issue, since it is well understood, many techniques have been implemented to mitigate or eliminate this issue. Since it is typically happening at a server you have no control of, it becomes hard for the end user to address. Another technique that is frequently employed by an ISP or third-party DNS provider is to return an IP for a known server when an invalid or non-existent domain name is requested. The impact of this ranges from none, annoying, to directing your computer to a site that may download malicious code. If a successful hijacking occurs, it may be to direct you to a site that will act as a middleman to the site you intended. An example of this man-in-the-middle attack is when you are intending to sign into an account at a financial institution. The IP address returned is a malicious server that will simply take your web queries and pass them to the bank. And when the bank responds, it will send the data to you. As far as you see, the transaction went as planned. However, Since all the raw data now becomes available to the malicious server, such as your account numbers and passwords, you are now exposed to a potential loss not only of data, but funds or other assets. There are techniques, such as site certificates, that mitigate this issue, but not necessarily completely. The largest issue is frequently the user simply ignores the security warning. Tracking your queries. While hijacking can be dramatic, the more subtle and, because of its volume and scope, perhaps more serious issue is tracking. There are many reasons that a party would want to know your DNS queries, both what was queried and when. The information is part of the big data that is collected by institutions such as intelligence agencies, marketers, tax collectors, police, and the criminal world, which defines the list. Those who have and know how to use this information wield significant power. Consider just knowing the DNS queries and nothing else what can be surmised. A set of queries gives a glimpse of what site you are on and when to the DNS provider without ever seeing the actual traffic. A given home, office, or phone's queries can be collected over time, and a number of things can be reasonably assumed. You may be showing that a certain time frame you are accessing entertainment sites and of what variety. Your selection of news, sports, music, religious, or other categories will not only indicate your interests, but of what persuasion you are in those interests. Note that this information is provided to the DNS service provider. Using encryption or HTTPS has no impact on this and hides nothing. What site you are interacting with is exposed, but not the data you are sharing. You are exposing your metadata, not your data. Remember, the metadata alone gives a huge amount of information about you. An extremely common technique with web pages and emails is to place a transparent 1 pixel square image on the page. It is not seen, but when you view the page or email, a request is made to download the image. You are informing a third party what you are viewing, when, and from where. For the site address of the image, such as image.example.net, a DNS query needs to be made. This gives some information to the DNS provider. By limiting the time that your computer will cache the query to perhaps a second, the time to live parameter, each time you view the page, a new query will occur. By using a unique site address for the image, such as 123.456.789.image.example.net, particular information is now being exposed to the DNS provider in cooperation with the web page provider. Many browsers will examine a page that you request and note all links on the page. Where it has not resolved the IP address for any link, it will do so before you click, so that the resolve time becomes essentially zero. However, in doing so, you are also leaking information about you, since the set of links can be mapped to a specific page or group of pages. In summary, whether in cooperation with or independent of the web page provider, your DNS queries alone, something that most are unaware is even happening, inform third parties a significant amount of information about you. This is not benign. Secure DNS Server. Many have noted and even built businesses around being a secure DNS service provider. Many issues are addressed, such as making the DNS query secure, so third parties, most notably your ISP, cannot see the DNS query. While it is true that a third party monitoring your connection cannot see the content of the query, they can see when a message is sent to the DNS provider's IP and which IPs are subsequently used by your computer. This is not as informative, but still contains a bit of information about you. But then there's the blatant issue. You are hiding your information from some parties, but handing it directly to another, the DNS provider. Consider well why a business would provide this service, especially when they provide it free. Data collection has little impact when it is done on a small scale. When done on a large scale, it can be extremely informative and lucrative. Providing the DNS service for free, offering faster query response, and a secure link is great marketing, but you are handing them all the data about you. Now they have a large data set to work with. Now they know you and those around you well. Now they have data of value. If they state they can be trusted, is it true? Are you their customer or their product? DNS filtering. An apparently helpful service that can be offered by a DNS provider is filtering. Queries for sites that have been flagged for various reasons can return either no result or an IP that links you to a warning or information about the site you requested. This can be helpful to keep you from known sites that may download malicious code to your computer or are phishing sites designed to fool you for malicious purposes. Other things can be done, such as keeping you from content you may not desire, such as morally offensive, politically offensive, excessively violent, or other concerns. This attitude, frequently noted as "think of the children," may market well and give a feeling of security to the end user, but there is a cost to the end user in that things that may be desired or helpful may be blocked. Consider that your given religious or political persuasion may be shielded from you by your DNS provider. Information about a subject or event may be censored at the decision or whim of the DNS provider. The sites and information exist and are available, but a third party, your DNS provider, prevents you from access. When your DNS provider offers or imposes a filter, when you have no option around the filter, or when you're not informed of the filter, you are the victim of censorship. Even when options are provided on what is filtered, simply making that selection provides a bit of information about you, including a sentiment of you are not falling in line with everyone else.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Matryoshka DNS Server. Many solutions are offered to some of the DNS issues, but most simply shift one problem for another, and you remain under the control of your provider. Using Matryoshka, a method of hiding both the DNS data and metadata becomes possible. How Matryoshka works is described in Why Matryoshka. Since there is no visibly distinct DNS message that can be observed by a listening party, such as your ISP, the fact that the DNS query is taking place is not revealed. While the first query for a given domain to a Matryoshka DNS server does require it to make the initial query to a DNS server, from that point it will continue to make queries as the time to live parameter indicates. Once in the system and the queries start, there is no longer any way to correlate a query to the user. Filtering remains possible, but Alice can choose one or more filter information providers. The filter provider's data is directly sent to Alice's computer, and the provider does not know if and when it is used. The DNS query is still returned, but Alice's computer, at the command of Alice, can accept or reject an individual filtered query. Alice can add custom filters or bypass a given filter. Both Matryoshka DNS and filtered services can be free or paid services, but the provider has no method to know who the customers are. The site that Alice is communicating with may do things to know and trace who is communicating with it, such as when signing in is required. All works as normal, but the tracking and spoofing via DNS has been removed. For all observers, including the ISP or intelligence agencies, the DNS traffic or metadata is not exposed. If Alice also uses Matryoshka nodes to communicate to the desired site, no data or metadata is exposed to any party, including the Matryoshka providers. Metadata about where Alice is communicating from has now been eliminated from the observer's eye. The final option, for limited circumstances, is when Alice is communicating with a Matryoshka site. In this case, no data or metadata is exposed. There is no hint that any communications ever takes place.